Thank you. Try moving this over just a little bit there. So thank you for inviting me to come today, and it's wonderful to share together. I've been in Atlanta a couple times to play in the past, but it's wonderful to be back here, and now, hopefully next time I will be here longer and we'll be able to see some of your sights. So as I began to work on this presentation, it brought back so many wonderful memories of Delbert Disselhorst. How many of you ever had the opportunity to hear him perform? You went to school with him. Wonderful. Well, I'm sure we'll have to catch up with lots of stories. So he was an immaculate musician, and if you've heard him perform, you'll notice that he performs by memorized performances, and always in the highest level of scholarship as well as musicianship. And so he's a great inspiration for those of us who had the opportunity to study with him. And as I was working, I was thinking, now what would Delbert Disselhorst give me for advice on this presentation? And the first thing I thought about, of course, was his passion for Bach and the way that he felt that it was so important to give of your best to the art, and that best to the art. So there's a great story in that we all had these opportunities to be in these organ literature classes. And sometimes he would say to the students in the class, if you're going to pump gas 100%, meaning that whatever you do in life, make sure that you give it your all. And he really did give all to his art. And so I think he's a good inspiration as we look at Bach's work. As I thought of inspiration, he would say to me, do your research. And so lots of times through the years, I have studied and performed and taught these works of Johann Sebastian Bach, but I tried to do the way that he did, as an example. Every time we had an organ literature class, the night before we would see him in the hallways, and he would be reading the most recent research, reviewing information that he'd learned in the past. And if he was going to talk about Samuel Scheidt, he wouldn't just play one piece of Samuel Scheidt that night that he would plan to play for us, but he'd play through the whole collection. So I tried to use his inspiration for that. And I really enjoyed going back and finding some books that I had read in the past and reading them from a new angle as far as finding new research as well. And I did try to include some of that in your handout. While doing that, I found a great joy that happened because of that. And so I think that's where he got his inspiration. The next element that I thought about was he would say to us, look at the past and also the future. So I have for you here, there's Del and I. Get this to advance. Okay, some of the inspirations that we have for Johann Sebastian Bach from the past. Symbolism in Bach, and he wrote a wonderful book that I've included in your handout about the symbolism and how it can be applied to Bach, and we'll talk about that as we go today. The second is Anton Heiler. As you know, Anton Heiler was, for many people, the one recording that they grew up on and listening to the Bach Orgelbüchlein. How many of you kind of grew up on Anton Heiler's recordings? A couple of you? Yeah. So he's definitely one of the past that really brought Bach's Orgelbüchlein to our course, the other, which you were hearing as you came in, was Helmut Volcha. Helmut Volcha, many of you may know, was a wonderful pedagogue that was in Germany, and many American students went to Germany to study. Dell was one of those who went, and he has these wonderful stories that he would tell about the lessons with Volcha. When he was learning Bach fugues, Volcha's wife, of course Volcha was blind, she would play each individual line for him, and that's how he would put it together in his mind and learn the music. So when he would study with his students, he would ask them, I'd like for you to play the soprano, alto, and the bass parts of this fugue and sing the tenor. You can't play the tenor line. And then he would alternate that around. And Dr. Disselhurst indicated that process that, of course, all the United States students were like going crazy about, but that was really very influential in the way that they understood and heard Bach from that point on. And so Volcha would be one that he would look from the past. But not all from the past, but also from the future. And we think of Russell Saunders. Many of you, any Eastman people here? Okay, good. So you know that Russell Saunders and Delbert Disselhurst had a wonderful friendship, and that they often shared scholarship. And so that would be a very important. Peter Williams, of course, we all recognize as being one of the scholars. Quentin Faulkner was from our area. And does anybody know this edition of Quentin Faulkner? We got a couple yes. So we'll kind of look at that in the future, but go ahead and pass that around so you can see some of the people that would have been influential. So we'll look at some of those new scholarships as well. There we go. So Delbert Disselhurst used to always say, the Bach Orgelbüchlein is the organist's Bible. And it really is, because each one of those selections is like an interpretation of Scripture. And so you can determine how Bach was thinking about Scripture. And as an organist, then we can actually use that as our Bible. And yeah, I got the picture off one. I had to pay, I think it's $12 there. I think it's much more now. So this is the Concordia edition. This is the edition that many of us used when learning these works. And so I will pass that around. And we just go that way. Of course, we know Bach's deep devotion to religion in praise of the Almighty's will and for my neighbor's greatest skill. Has anybody seen this source, J.S. Bach in Scripture? This is a wonderful, because it's actually a facsimile of Bach's Bible. And on the edges, in some of the pages, you will see his writings, and you will see what he was thinking about it. And then on the other ones that he didn't write, like here's one of his little thoughts on the side. Sometimes then they will actually interpret places in the Bible and relate it to different pieces. So this is a wonderful source we'll pull from this side about Bach in Scripture. And we all know the title page, and we'll talk about where this came from as we go. Okay, so some collections that actually inspired Bach. There was Bach's older brother, who was a pupil of Pachelbel, and Pachelbel wrote a collection of chorale settings that could have inspired Bach. Also, Johann Christoph Bach wrote some chorale settings, and these would be inspiration for Bach. The autograph, now I'm sure when you first learned some of these pieces, you looked in the preface and you saw all the list of the pieces that were intended, 164, 46 of them were completed. But as we look at it a little bit deeper, let's look at some things about that. There were 60 that were for a specific time of the year and 104 for any season. This is important. 70% of the chorales date from the 16th century. So that could have been shaping what Bach felt was important to set as a chorale. those from the past, 30 chorales by Luther, which we would anticipate. And Bach placed the Nunkom, the first part of his collection, and that was typical of most hymnals of the day, that they would begin with Nunkom. There were no Epiphany and only 3 Trinity, which is interesting. So it was kind of two years, liturgical year, the life, ministry, and death of Christ, and then the ministry of the church, which were all settings included in that collection. Sean?
Yes.
You know that little book that was a facsimile?
Yes.
That is missing. I'm not sure what happened to that. Huh?
I wonder if that might be, that's funny, if they're propping the. It's that, yeah, they're propping.
Oh, okay. Well, all right. So we don't have to take it out then. So underneath there actually is a facsimile. Oh, how sacrilege! Is a facsimile of Bach's Orgelbüchlein. And definitely after we go upstairs, you're going to want to take that and browse through it, because it's almost like you're part of the past, because you'll see those places where he wrote down the title of the chorale and then there were the blank pages. So he had so many more things in mind to put, but he was only finishing a certain amount. Whether he ran out of time, got involved with another project, we don't know. Well, that might not work. Okay, here is that. Yeah, so you can see that there's this title page, there's pieces that are in here, and we can determine by this that Bach wrote the chorale first, then he went back and wrote the other parts within that, and he wrote the titles. But there are pages then, such as this, that are completely empty. Why don't I give you back this? I don't want you to. You're good?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Now we got all kinds of fun things there. Hopefully, all right. So I'll pass this around and you can get part of history there. That's low. Okay. It includes a great variety in the chorale heritage. It's interesting, remember that Luther, when he was going through the Protestant Reformation, he didn't want to lose the past. And Bach also did not want to lose the past. He's using many of those plain song medieval hymns that's linking us to the past that Luther had kind of brought to the future. Secular song and dance, just as Luther, let's not just leave out those. Many of them were from Martin Luther, Johann Kruger, Johann Walther are our big names. So how did he choose which chorales he was going to use? There are some fun theories. One is that there was a new hymnal that was put out in 1713. We know that hymnal that was put out was very important because that hymnal was put into a procession. They had a big consecration event, and at that event, they decided that they would bring in special symbols of the church, and that new edition went in as a symbol. And so there are theorists, and one of it is Ernst Arfken, said that all the hymns that Bach used were from that particular series, so I believe that he was inspired by that. There is another theory. There's no contemporary hymn book at that time that had the similar sequence, so why did Bach choose the sequence of hymns that he did? And Robin Lever, who is down here at the bottom, Bach and Hymnody, the evidence of the Orgelbüchlein, has this wonderful theory that he believes that Bach began to consider the idea while he was in Arnstadt. So remember, Arnstadt was before he went to Weimar, and Weimar was before Cöthen. So there, in Arnstadt, Bach had taken that travel to Buxtehude and had heard Buxtehude. And when he came back, remember, he started writing all these avant-garde kind of chorale settings, and people were up in arms and wrote all these letters to the authorities. And so perhaps at that point he got interested in writing a new way of chorales, and is exploring that in his writings. Or perhaps when he was in Arnstadt, he also knew this Johann Christoph Oleris. He was the librarian there, and that librarian was very involved with hymnody and the elements of historical hymnody. So he would have probably been talking with Bach, and he says, I found all this information about all these older hymns, and he wrote it. And so perhaps that was the impetus for why Bach began to write it. And there's the organ at Arnstadt. So as you look at the spec list, you'll see some of the stops that what Bach would have had when he was writing this collection and how that might have inspired him, and the city where he was working at the time. So other scholars after that point began to think about what is the proof that most of these chorales were written in Weimar. And just some highlights there. Spitta said it was written in Weimar. Title page was written later. Dadelson, there were manuscript copies that his pupil did that would have been at that time. The watermarks, the handwriting, and that the words were not written in the order of appearance, that those would have been some ways of knowing that Bach wrote it in Weimar. And then some contemporary scholars, Christoph Wolff, said that Bach would have had immediate need for repertoire. So while he was in Weimar, he had to play all these hymn settings, so he had the need. So there would be there. And Robert Marshall, first systematic attempt for a well-regulated church music. So you remember in Bach's life, he wanted to try out every way to write an invention, every way to write a fugue, all those collections that he has was way of like trying to test the waters, how he could do this. And so the Orgelbüchlein is his first time to actually write a collection of things to see every way that he could write a piece. And then Russell Stinson. Does everybody have Bach, the Orgelbüchlein of Russell Stinson? I see just a couple. Oh, this is like the source to go to. If you want to buy one book about the Orgelbüchlein, buy Russell Stinson's The Orgelbüchlein. He goes through all the history of the collection, but then takes each chorale and talks about it in depth, talks about additions. This is the source. I noticed in the acknowledgments to this, he acknowledges Delbert Disselhorst because I believe that he sent his source to Dr. Disselhorst, and he read through it and gave him some corrections and additions and changes based on the research that he had gathered through the years. So it really is a top-notch source. And he does a comparison of handwriting, of course, sharp cancellation, system used, soprano clefs, size of script. So now some fun things here. So we know it's a collection of liturgical organ music. We know that it was kind of like a compositional treatise because he is exploring various ways to treat a chorale. It's a theological statement because he's going to use so much symbolism in text painting, and also an organ method. Now, just exploring each part. Bach as pedagogue. So here you see Bach with his numerous children, teaching them. I don't know how he wrote so many chorale preludes with all the children he had. This statement is really good. This is from the Russell Stinson book, and George Stauffer, who is one of the leading pedagogues, says, "No other volume of music is so well known to organists as the Orgelbüchlein of Johann Sebastian Bach. For generations of players, it has stood as the first resource for honing manual and pedal skills. As Bach, two-part inventions, three-part symphonias, and well-tempered clavier are to pianists and harpsichords, so the Orgelbüchlein is central to the educational process, a pedagogical aid that no student or instructor can be without." So I'm sure you've read this preface, but let's look again. Translation, little organ book in which guidance is given to an inquiring organist in how to accomplish a chorale in all kinds of ways, and at the same time to become practiced in the study of pedaling, since in the chorales found therein the pedal is treated completely obligato, for the highest God alone honor, for my neighbor, that he may instruct himself from it. Now there are a couple little phrases from that that's interesting. Guidance giving to an inquiring organist. That inquiring organist, do many of you teach students? We have some teachers here. And you know there's a big difference between the student who really is inquiring and those who are not. And so Bach is really noticing that difference, and he's saying this is for the inquiring organist. One that maybe not has already mastered the art of composition or playing. And then the other interesting one is for my neighbor, the ones closest to me, not the connoisseur or those who have claimed a rightful position on the heights of Parnassus. So he's really thinking about neighbor and how he can help mankind. Bach described as a teacher by Forkel, who was one of the first biographers. Only he who knows much can teach much. Let's hope we know much. Only he who has become acquainted with dangers, who has himself encountered and overcome them, can properly point them out and successfully teach his followers how to avoid them. Both were united in Bach. His teaching was, therefore, the most instructive, the most proper, and the most secure that ever was known. And all his scholars trod, at least in some one branch of the art, in the footsteps of their great master, though none of them equaled, much less surpassed him. So there is a great respect for the pedagogue of Bach. However, he can't be simply a pedagogical source, and many of us learned that when we were first learning Bach. Oh, this is what Bach did for his students. We know that because of the manuscript. This is the manuscript of Inventions. Look how clean and precise it is. It was definitely intended for teaching, and he had done this with many students. It was going to be important. Now compare that with the Orgelbüchlein. Now we know that he had to mush in some of these notes because he didn't have enough room in the page, because he had originally put the soprano all in and then had to fit it into one page. But do you also notice that there are little corrections and little changes within it? That's not a kind of score that my students are going to very likely want to play and practice. And so we don't have a lot of copies of it. So Bach wasn't teaching this on a regular basis as he might have taught other pieces. And how were they performed? We know that it's not completely instructional, but Harald Vogel argues that they could be used with congregational singing. So let's see if you agree. Worked pretty good, didn't it? Mm-hmm. In that case, he actually you could have had the congregation just sing the soprano line, but he's having the canonic verses sung by chorale. This is the Aberlid recording here. It's in your handout. So some of them would probably not work as well as that one does, but I thought that would be kind of a fun one to do with the choir. It was an easy one for them to learn, and they could do that next time you're going to play that piece. All right, okay. So first systematic approach, and if you look at this list, you'll notice all the ways that Bach would often try to use information and try to write a collection of pieces for study. Now, some things about the way that there are some ways of treating. Many of the chorales are melody chorales. And in the chorale, you can see that the chorale is appearing here in the top. Very easy to find, very little ornamentation, a few steps, filling in a step. And then the other voices are working together. The two voices here, and then the pedal in some way is combining together. That's the typical melody chorale. It's typically 4 voices, and the pedal can have its own motive, or it can be based on the motive of the alto and tenor. So another type of chorale that's included are chorale canons. This is the Indulce you heard, the original manuscript. There are 9 of them. And then the ornamented chorale, and you can see his ornamentation here, so much more florid. And then the final one is a chorale fantasy. And In Dearest Freude, let's see, I think you're playing that, aren't you, Caroline? Yeah, Caroline. Is it Caroline or Caroline?
I think you're asking it's Caroline.
Caroline, okay. So it has expansive interludes, and you can see the blue is the chorale-based material, and the purple is the interludes and free material. And so it's much more involved, and it has multiple statements of the phrases. And when we hear her play that, we'll note that. So the reception of how we know it today, Bach's pupils, of course. Did you know that the autograph was inherited by CPE? And you know sometimes CPE did not always keep good care of his father's autograph, so we lost some works, but luckily for us, he did. And then copies were made by Kernberg and Schultz. And then it was printed first in Friedrich Wilhelm Marburg in 1784. So a long time before it was actually printed. Then we have Mendelssohn, who had fragmented versions. Some of the sources you'll read, it'll say Mendelssohn had the autograph. He didn't actually have the full autograph. It's just fragments that he had. But he gathered them, and he printed an edition in 1845 in England. And then our Bach Gesellschaft was in 1850, 1878, first to preserve Bach's ordering. So before that time, they just put it in whatever order they wanted. And here we have it preserving Bach's order. And then 1846, Peters, and 1850, Bach Gesellschaft was founded in 1878, first to preserve. William Thomas Best, Novello. I didn't realize this. Did you know Fauré did an edition? Until I was going to this extra research, that he completed an edition for Durand and Sons. And Albert Riemenschneider, we know, followed the autograph. Marcel Dupré, Albert Schweitzer, Charles Vidor. And then some of the modern ones, Breitkopf and Hertel, Editio Musica, Concordia. How many of you learned with Concordia? Probably a large percentage of us. How many did Neue Bach-Ausgabe when you were first learning? Bärenreiter? No? Okay. And then as I passed out there is the Quentin Faulkner edition, Kevin Mayhew, Urtext, Breitkopf, and then the newest one. And this is a great source that has all of that, which talked about in detail the Fauré one as well. So looking at, probably not many of you own this particular one. I know a couple here said they did. There are some benefits in this, that if you were teaching a student and you didn't have time to help them with a lot of fingering and you want them to be able to learn something quickly, this gives them historical information. All the fingering that he chose, which has a lot, are from historical models. Now, as you look at it, some of the challenges of this is like a fingering overload sometimes for students, and especially for myself. So what I did when I was looking through some of the chorales preparing for this is I would read it first in the Concordia, which I had learned from, played it through there. Then I took the NBA, played it through there, and then I took this one and played it through and got my feelings of what I learned or how I played it differently. And interestingly enough, I felt each edition gave me a little bit more insight into not just performance practice, but also some new things I hadn't discovered before. For example, for me to play so many fingerings, I had to slow down the tempo. And in that, I discovered some chromaticism I hadn't learned before. And so there are benefits. Even if a certain edition is not your favorite, it's a good thing to have several and then to play them back to back. So this is historical. As I played through it, I thought, well, I would have probably done this, where I would have had the break here after this note and started it here so that I had the shifting. And he has shifting as well, but his shifting is occurring after this 16th, which could create a space in the place where wouldn't be my first choice for the space. So as I was playing with the students, I would have to give them other alternatives. But generally, that is some of the cases. Now, many of you know the George Stauffe organ method. Many of us use that with our students. And as you look at this particular score, you'll see that there are some fingerings, but it's a little bit more sparse. The pedaling markings are there. And some interesting things is he's telling us what notes you need to prepare next. And so he has those in parentheses, because as you know, when you're working with students, it's often that preparation of the next note that gives them the challenge. So just some thoughts about that. Now, where Schweitzer, of course, was the first to really think about how the spirit of text influences music. He's coming from Spida, who said there were only 3 examples where you can see the accompanimental figure that is derived from the melody of the chorale tune. And so if you look at this one, he says this is one of the 3 times. We see there's the chorale, here is exact same material from the chorale. And so that's one of the examples. Same thing down here. The material and the accompanimental figures come from the chorale. Now compare that only 3 times to a recent article, Melodic Process in Johann Sebastian Bach's Orgelbüchlein. And this one is a computer analysis. So they put all the notes of a particular chorale prelude in, and they found out how many times that they related. So let's look. They test their hypotheses, and they found that a lot of the material is coming from this. So they're dividing them into subsets, patterns matching, and they're search for the phrase, and they mark in the music. And the 3 ways is the material derived from the incipit of the first phrase? Is it derived from an unusual cadence, or is it within the piece? There are ways of looking at that recurring, is with it's going to state it at the beginning and can continue. Does it precede the phrase, or is it after the chorale is stated, or simultaneously? All right, here's some results. So here is the chorale phrase, and here are all the ways that this material is related to it. So you can see the pink subset of the chorale, those 3 notes, can be found here. There's a chorale, but look at all the places where that came up in the computer analysis, that they were the same materials. And the blue, that part of the phrase, how many times that the blue came from that. And the orange. So it's like almost every note can go back to the chorale. And that's, of course, a computer analysis, so it's being non-judgmental and non-biased. Of course, it may be that if you look at that material, that E, D, E, C is a common melodic figure, right? So it's very likely that he's using those materials. But it is interesting, I think, to see it from a computer standpoint. Again, here's Herr Jesu Christ. We have all of those that are related to. Again, it's almost every one. So that's kind of an interesting recent research that's being done, and to see how much a Bach is using based on the chorale tune. We all know the doctrine of musical figures, and as you look through this list of definitions from that, let me draw your attention to this one. Defined as various attempts made in the 17th and 18th century to codify music according to classes of musical figures thought to be analogous to the figures of rhetoric. All composers of the age attempted to portray words, even ideas, by using musical figures that have a pictorial quality expressible in the very graphic image of the score. And these motives or patterns are present in the composition. So if we look at possibilities, one is the suspirans, which is a stepwise motion. If you look at all these examples, it's based on that ascending or descending motive, and they always start with the rest. Do you notice how often it's off the beat, right? Over here, we're still off the beat, off the beat. And so that is one musical gesture that is often used. Another is a chromatically filled in fourth. And there's the fancy name for it, so you can go home today and impress your significant others with your new word. And it's that filled in passing fourth. And then figura quarta, which is the rhythms. So we've all learned from the past that this is like the joy motive. That comes from that rhetoric figure. And then symbolism. So this one I think is really important. This is the last pupil of Bach's who said, "He instructed me when playing hymns not to treat the melody as if it alone were important, but to interpret the words through the melody, according to the sense of the words." So Bach was trying to text paint, and he tried to share that with his students. Michael Radulescu, who is another important scholar today, said that many of them relate to Scripture, and we'll see that. For a composer so deeply rooted in Protestant tradition, the treasury of Lutheran hymns formed the foundation. And then, have you ever heard of this? Johann Schmidt's Biblische Mathematics of 1738. It actually discussed the use of symbolic use of numbers and figures. And sometimes in your prefaces, you'll see like 3 represents the Trinity, 7 represents the 7 days of the week. It comes back to this source that's first talking about it. Pioneer works, and then the German scholar that's involved with that now. So there are various forms of these symbolism. Stepwise descending scale. Schweitzer and some of those early writers talk about that being incarnation, answered prayer, Christ's descent to earth, and we'll hear that today when we hear some of the pieces. Ascending scale, imploring heaven. A combination, acceptance by heaven. And stepwise parallel 6, resignation of the Lamb to the will of the Father. So when we go upstairs later, I want you to kind of we'll think back to those. Descending movements by leaps, incarnation, augmented sin, and leaps, resurrection. And then more that Schweitzer has in that book. Schweitzer wrote a whole book about the symbolism and different forms of way Bach used his music, and it's been translated. And this is one of these. Motives in the pedal with leaps that move upward represent firm belief. And this is from Wir glauben all. And notice how we have a C, a D, a E moving upward, and that's that firm belief. And then neighbor groups, we're going to hear Sean play this Nun Komm, which has this cross figure, and that neighbor groups of 4 notes are representing the cross. Arpeggios, the Holy Spirit. Descending repeated notes, the suffering of Christ, which we'll see next time, and the passion of Christ. Different rhythms, the dactyl, bum, ba-da-dum, 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 is joy. Repeated notes, the law. Here's this. Look at all the repeated notes there, and which, interestingly enough, has the number 10 many times, which is the commandments, and the French overture. So numerology then in particular. Did you know that numerology actually was important to the church fathers? St. Augustine and Gregory the Great wrote about it in that book, Faith and Numbers, which is more about how numbers have been used through the centuries to be involved with faith. So it's not a new thing to think about Bach and numbers. And you've probably heard the story about, this is all about when Bach wanted to join the Society of kind of mathematical proportions and philosophy on numbers, that he had to write a composition. He wrote the composition with many things about 14. So he, here we go, up. So look at here, Bach's entry, number 14. There were 14 buttons on his coat. He had to include a picture. He was the 14th member of the society. He knew that one of his colleagues was going to join the society, but that colleague was number 11. So he didn't join until he was actually going to be number 14. So he was that adamant about the number 14. There are 14 notes between the repeat bar lines. 3 canons of basic form occur as canons at 4, 5, and 5, which equals 14. 3 canons of 3 form canons at 2nd, 3rd, and 9th, which equals 14. So for this society, he was obsessed with that number 14. Did he use it other places? Of course. Musical high points. The theme can occur a number of times. And then as you look through this number, Trinity we see all the time, right? The 5 wounds of man. 7, the perfect number. This one's kind of fun. There are 7 preludes in the Passion section of the Orgelbüchlein. Was that intended? There were 7 pedal quavers in each phrase of Komm Gott Schöpfer, which is Come Holy Ghost. So was that intended? And then 10 commandments, we know the 12 apostles. BACH, 14. The reverse of that is 41, which also spells Bach. And 158 is if every letter of Johann Sebastian Bach added together equals 158. Isn't it interesting that 1 + 5 + 8 = 14? Now they say that when Bach was young, he loved these number games, and he was that was like an intellectual activity for him. Rather than doing cell phones, he was doing these number activities. And so we can see that he must have, like the day he figured out that his name Bach made 14, that his name made 14, 41, 158, he was like probably, oh, this is so cool kind of feeling. Number 84 in the Bach B minor Mass, he put that number actually in the score, 84. And there are all these ways that combine together to create the number 84 in the B minor Mass. I'll encourage you to kind of look over that sometime. That's in your handout for later digging. The number 144, the Leipzig C minor prelude, has 2 themes that account for 144 bars, 12 times 12 being the large trinity. How perfect can you be? 3 + 3 + 3 = 12. 3 times 3 times 3 kind of thing. And then in that one, there were 2 themes of 89 and 55, which equals 144. But did you know that 89 and 55 are the last 2 numbers of the Fibonacci series that actually fall together? And so this whole element of, does everybody know what Fibonacci series is? That's that ratio. If you see a butterfly, you'll find the Fibonacci series within its wings, the Mona Lisa. Bach was interested in that as well. The number 27, those who play the Klavierübung, 27 pieces, 3 themes in the prelude, 3 themes in the fugue, the spirit. And then there's some articles on numerology. So numerology was very important to Bach, and we can definitely kind of understand that that would be part of our processing. Registration. This is a really good book if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about registration of Bach. This is by Thomas Harmon. And if you look at this list, there's some interesting things for you to consider. He had a fondness for 32-foot pedal stops. So when you're afraid to use your 32-foot on your preludes, don't be, because he had a fondness for it too. He used reed stops of 16-foot, and he liked the cantabile solo reeds. So we often think about the sesquialter, right, as a solo sound, but he also used some of those solo reeds. Manual couplers. We have to kind of take that in context that perhaps some of those manual couplers at times were the plenum kind of sources when he was trying to add a little bit more. In our United States organ, sometimes the plenums are at different locations far away and they don't really combine to create a unity. But he did use them at times. He had affinity for string tone at 8 and 4 foot pitch in the sesquialter, and it correlated with the affect of the piece. So as we go upstairs, you're going to notice that each prelude, I've given you a couple different registration examples, and they're going to relate in some way to the text. So I will pass this around if you don't know that source. Okay, tempo can vary. Listen, Quan said this. It would be too long and at times impossible to give demonstrative points on matters which nearly always look only to taste. Some like what is majestic and lively, and others what is tender and gay. One is not always in the same mood. So when you hear people say, oh, that one's supposed to be played fast, or that one's supposed to be played slow, give us some thought. This, just the opening, is Anton Heiler. So a very meditative form. Playing them faster. This one is Olivia Latry, a Silbermann organ. So just giving as a way of demonstrating that there are a lot of different interpretations that can be made for anything of Bach, but that can also occur with registration, and they're both all reading the text and all gaining something different from the text. So today I hope there's never any point where you think, oh, she has it, or he has it, or who, because they're all important. Some selected bibliography sources. These are some of the books that I found kind of helpful. Do you know the Mark Bigley, the Lutheran chorales in the organ setting? He goes through and does every one of the Bach chorales, and not just an Orgelbüchlein, but like if you're doing the grade 18. He takes the text and he translates it, so it's kind of a good overall source that has all the chorales. If you do the Orgelbüchlein, you know Concordia does a translation of a few verses for each one. If you do NBA, you know they don't include the translations. Or the Faulkner includes a couple different verses. So this is kind of a nice source to have it all together if you're doing any organ work of Bach that's based on a chorale. These, the Advent and Christmas chorales, you're going to see in your handout when we go into those that there are going to be places where it says their names because these people had like a good idea that I included in there for each particular chorale. The melodic process was the computer analysis, Donington, the rhythm, the date of the Orgelbüchlein, the Faulkner. If you don't want the Faulkner text for the edition, you think maybe perhaps that's too much fingering or too much pedaling, still get it because it has a wonderful preface that talks about each chorale in detail. It talks about so many things. And then some more information here, and that's all in your handout that you'll be able to see those. Okay. I think this is interesting that Delbert Disselhorst said, there is nothing of artistic excellence that does not bear repetition and restudy. There is nothing of artistic excellence that does not bear repetition and restudy. And so he was thinking about, in his talk about Orgelbüchlein, the fact that even if it's something that you've learned and you've played in the past, when you look at it from a new light, you gain something else. And I think that's why in his organ literature classes, the night before, he was always trying to re-look at something, find more information, find more research. And so as we go through the chorales today, that is my hope. Just 1 second here, check my time. That we look at it from a new realm. Okay. Now, I want to skip here and look at more detail in a couple things. We have time here. This is the BWV 600. If you'll look at your handout, you'll notice, does everybody have your handouts? Okay, good. The first page kind of talks about where things are at, and so that opening information that I gave you was based on that. And then at the end, there are each chorale, and it talks about the text of it, the registration ideas, as well as some particular information in each one. Question about the format of that? Okay, good. All right, so, also, if you look at the last page of your handout, that will give you the list of the recordings that I was using. And it's interesting to note that the first few recordings listed there, and we'll use them on some of these chorales that some of you are not playing, that they all have, were acknowledged by a particular magazine. So let me give you an example here. Okay, so the first list there was Paul Riley chooses the best recordings, and he chose for his recordings David Good, Ulrich Boom, Renee Sagorn, I can't pronounce that, and Stephen Farr. Those were the 5 that he felt was the best for the Orgelbüchlein based on the sound of the organ and based on their interpretations of the text. Now, if you look at the next list, that was done on a site for Bach cantatas, and they chose, the only one that's similar is the Renee Sargin. Anybody know how to pronounce that?
Sorjan.
Thank you, Sorjan. And so that's the only one that they both chose and then had a complete different list. Now, if we went around here, we all have our favorite recordings. A couple other ones listed additional. I wanted to, of course, include the Heiler, the Schweitzer, and the Walche. But then that one that you heard with the choir is the very last one there, the Benjamin Ehlard. That was the one that includes choral or congregational settings to see how Bach would have used that, which is interesting. All these can be found, or portions of them can be found on YouTube, and so you can go and find like an excerpt and decide, oh, I do like this, and I want to get this recording. And then the one in the middle there, good playlist of Heiler. I would really highly recommend that if you want to find some more historic ones, because he not only has a video about it, but he has a whole list of other places to find Heiler. And so it's kind of a good way of finding some of those. Okay, so in this particular one, I'm going to skip here to this one. This is one of the examples of the chorales that you're not playing that I wanted to include one of those recordings for. So before we do that, notice how it relates to the cantus firmus. Here we have these notes that relate to the cantus firmus, G, A, B, G, A, B. And so on the computer analysis, it would have come up as being related. It's a melody chorale, so it has the melody always in the top voice. Some more skips than we had in our Der Tag, right? We have filling in thirds here. But still always there, the 2 voices working together. And then would you say the pedal is independent, or is it related to the alto and tenor voices? Would you say? I heard you say, you said independent? You're related? So, it is, I mean, I guess, yeah, some ways it's related, but it's not the same theme as that. We have more skips here than that. And so some of the melody chorales have it really intertwined as far as the same melodic material, and other times rhythmically similar, but melodically different. But notice how he, even within this, has this figure here, the incarnation idea, and then inverts it. So now we have octaves going the opposite direction. We have the ideas of leaping pedals, which is incarnation. And then all these little X's here are places that have, here's F sharp and then F natural. F sharp, F natural. So he's really going between not one key signature, but almost modal in this one. So let's listen to David Good. Okay, so a good performance. Notice that this is one of the times where Bach indicates for 2 keyboards. Very seldom does he do that, but he asked for 2 keyboards. It's a wonderful opportunity to show off that Sesquihalter. It's also possible to have a bigger registration with the reed and the pedal. That would be another possibility than what we heard. Embellished chorale line in sopranos represents intense joy. And that was a quote from Dr. Deborah Disselhorst. Articulated rhythms. Did you notice that the pedal, it was inverted in the last bar? And this inversion here, many think that it's showing the Kyrie. The element, the word at that point is Kyrie, and that's the ascension of the prayers to God. So the symbolism there. Interesting, there's only 1 trill in the piece. Okay, and let us compare that with the next one here. Whoops. We're going to skip here because we're going to go back to some of these. To Vom Himmel komm. So this is another one that many people will say, this should be on 2 manuals. And so if you look at it, there's some reason why they believe that it could be on 2 manuals, because there's lots of times where things are kind of back and forth, or is it not? But Anton Heiler says for sure is 1 keyboard, because there are always a rest in locations where it's moving back and forth. So that is a example of that. And 16 notes have the flight idea. Let's listen to this. And this is for the text of angels, so let's see if we hear some angels. So how many other instances do you know that Bach wrote this, a setting on this chorale? Any other time that you can think of that you have played a chorale based on this? Trick question, there are no other examples. So this is the only time that Bach wrote a chorale based on this, or a chorale prelude based on this chorale. It's interesting that it had a wide range. Did you hear how low we were at and how high we were at? It's the biggest range of all the chorale preludes. It's going from the lowest note up to the top, showing the humanity of all mankind moving there. Did you kind of hear the angel wings going from heaven down to earth, back and forth, fleeting there? So Spitta said, Bach's music rushes down and up again like the descending and ascending messengers of heaven. Some text painting within that. And then Schweitzer said, the ascending and descending scale figures conjures up Jacob's vision, a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. And interestingly enough, the descending motive occurs 29 times. What is 29? Solo Deo Gloria. S plus D plus G equals 29. So was it 29 times on purpose? I don't know. We'll have to ask. We got a lot of questions for him. And really, when Delbert Disselhorst, the day he died, I thought, wow, he's up there asking all those questions, because he had so many questions that he always said, I'm going to ask Bach this first time. And so I'm sure that he already had a meeting arranged for that. So that was a recording by Elric Boom. So kind of interesting quality of that one. And now Whoops, sorry. It doesn't like to do it. Here is, this spot is interesting that it's differences and additions. I went through an errata, which was actually prepared by Larry Smith. Many of you know him from the University of Indiana. And he went through all of the additions and the differences in each one. Most of them are simple things like a tie. But this is an example where it can create a different effect because some additions have an E flat, F natural, F sharp, and those places actually there are just a little bit of differences. So in the scores as we listen today, those are marked in there as differences that I felt were more than just a tie kind of issue. Okay. And then in Dulcia below, you heard with the choir. Now let's hear with an organ. And there's some interesting things on this. Note that the text painting, draw me to thee. So why does Bach choose canons? Sometimes it's for the fact of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. One is leading the other. So someone is following. God the Father, the Son follows. The Holy Spirit follows. In other cases, it's part of the text, and the draw me to thee could be a basis for the canon. And that's, a lot of scholars believe that. Also, this tune is often set to a canon, so it's kind of a common one. It's very easy to set for a canon for a composer, so that is the case. Why the key of A major? Perhaps that's the alpha and omega of the opening stanza. So that's sometimes used as to represent that. The drone here with the repeated A's, like a bagpipe that's often used at Christmas time. And then let's look at that F sharp minor chord. Maybe, I don't want to do that. Hold on, I want to come back to you. Here we go. This F sharp chord here, major chord, out of A major, we don't expect to have an F sharp major chord, occurs at the moment in the text that shines like the sun. He is alpha and omega. Shines like the sun. Wouldn't A major and moving to F sharp, if you went up to it, yeah, it really shines like the sun there. So that's a text painting, which is really interesting. The ending pedal point has a long A there, right, under all of that. And that is another example of alpha and omega, because if we have something that's the beginning and the end, to have a pedal point demonstrates that text painting at that point. The only time Bach uses a double canon. Did you catch that? Look at that. We have our opening chorale. We expect that to be done, but also the inner voices are done in a canonic version. So it is a double canon. And everybody talks about, oh, this is canon, but the fact that it's a double canon is quite amazing. He does not, in the second phrase, use that. If you look back over here, you notice this one, now it's no longer working in a canonic form, it's working as a unit together, but it did have a pretty long canon at the beginning of that. The canon for the second half is measure 25. This is harder to see than I thought from there. That's a 2-measure length. Oh, here we go. Yeah, at this point right here. So here it comes into canon. The first part it was coming only in at a measure, and now it's coming in at 2 measures apart. So why it would have done that was for harmonic reasons, because you're moving into the key of F sharp major, so there are many more challenges within that. So now let's go back and listen. And the age-old question in this part is, do we do 2 against 3, or do we put them together? So what I mean by that is, at this point, many scholars believe that the normal way of doing these would be to put it with a third one. That was they didn't really have a way of designing that. However, others have said, no, there are places where he actually notates a triplet, which would be in the next page here. And you'll see here at the shining of the sun, he's actually written the triplet kind of figure, and he put it more like in a way. Now, we don't know by looking at the manuscript because remember Bach wrote the melodies first and he's trying to fit this stuff in, so you really can't tell because sometimes it looks closer here, sometimes it looks closer there. So that gives us no clues. But I'm going to make sure I say that. Russell Saunders said that he thought that the duplets set to triple meters were normally notated as dotted eighths. Donington and Michael Collins felt that we should assimilate them. Heiler and Radulescu said that Bach distinguished. Vogel says play 3 against 2 for repeated notes based on French inégale. So what does all that say? Is everybody disagrees. There is no consensus, and there is no like recent article that says, I got the answer, right? Because there are really so many ways of interpreting that. What we don't know. So you have to decide yourself. Let's listen to see how this particular performer did it. Maybe. Come on. Technology is great, except when it doesn't work. Okay. So he kind of slowed it down at the end, so you probably heard what he did here, right? Was it together or was it opposite times? Did you hear that at the end? Let me let you listen to just the end again. Whoops. Ah. Well, we certainly heard that cadence. So was it lined up? No, correct, it was not. Right. So what he's doing in his particular case here is these are done at opposite points, and this was done together here. These were done together because they were like dee da dum ba bum, and then all of the moving lines were at opposite times. So each one of the recordings you're going to hear is going to have that done differently. So you got to make your decision. So I think now would be a good kind of point to ask you if you have any questions, and then we'll go upstairs and we'll look at some more of these in detail and get to hear some wonderful performances from your friends and colleagues. Any questions so far about any of the symbolism or about your handout, where to find materials? Yeah, Sean.
What's the alpha and omega? Why A major, alpha and omega?
Well, the number one, there was a long pedal note at the end, and so that was representing alpha and omega because we're continuing in that, always being going on and on and on. And the key of A major, Dell just felt that that key being A major was representing alpha, maybe A. But just the whole numbers, letter symbolism.
So
Oh yeah, sorry.
I'm just intrigued your note about the bagpipe for that repeated A note. I just didn't. I never imagined the bagpipe in Bach's life, but I suppose why not?
Well, if you think about some of his pastoral settings, that you kind of hear like that element of even like this. That has kind of an element of a bagpipe kind of quality, like shepherds and things moving. And so that was that, yeah. I don't know that it necessarily had a bagpipe as such at that time. I don't know. Does anybody know? Good question. That's a good research. And so in February, you'll tell us the answer.
Like a non-Scottish bagpipe,
Or other drone instruments.
Other drone instruments, yeah, more of a drone. Yeah, that's a better word for that. Yeah, good. Yeah, so what I have in mind is for us to go upstairs and we're going to hear through these and kind of analyze them. And then in February, when I come back, I want to kind of, in this opening part, talk more about the pedagogy of the Orgelbüchlein and what are some of the challenges to students learning it, for us learning it, as far as what are some of the places that are difficult and what are some of the ways of overcoming some of that. But today I wanted to really go through, where the sources come from, what's the history of the Orgelbüchlein, and so hopefully that will be fun. And any other questions? So Sean, you want to give them some directions?
Yeah, so feel free to get some food here and take a break. We'll use the restroom break now. As you exit out these doors here and turn left, restrooms are on the left-hand side, both for women and men. And then there are stairs that go up, and you'll see the sanctuary. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks, guys.